Australia growing too fast? That's the question we're going to ask and, I guess, answer today. So welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where in general we discuss property investment, wealth creation and the psychology of success. But joining me today is Ross Elliott, a seasoned urban development commentator whose recent article stirred the pot by highlighting the consequences of Australia's population surge, especially in hotspots like Southeast Queensland. Now, his insights shed light on some of the pressing issues that come with the significant growth Australia's experiencing, and it's a lot more than just the housing shortage. And since you're most likely interested in the future of Australia's housing market, because you're listening to my podcast, I thought that it would be a really important topic for me to share with you today. So let's dive into this complex tapestry of urban development and explore what it truly means to grow at a pace that doesn't just chase numbers, but we want it actually to enhance the lives of all Australians.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's authority in wealth creation through property, who has been voted one of Australia's top 50 most influential thought leaders.
Australia's population recently reached 27 million people. Actually, that was 30 years ahead of some of the forecasts made by the government a decade or two ago. In fact, Australia's population has increased by 624,100 people over the last year. Now, that's equivalent to more than the entire state of Tasmania in just 1 year. And based on the annual growth rate of 2.4%, Australia's population is going to be 41 million people by 2042. That's actually 16 million more than the government estimates from 2002. Now, of course, we keep reading about our surging population causing strains on our infrastructure, the housing shortages, and the challenges of maintaining the quality of life many of us want. So I'm going to have a chat with my guest today, Ross Elliott, who spent more than 30 years in the real estate and property industry. He's had some very significant roles, including the State Executive Director and Chief Operating Officer of the Property Council of Australia. He's also been the Executive Director of the Residential Development Council, a whole lot of accolades. But what it really means is that he understands about urban development and our housing markets. So in today's conversation, I'd like to unpack the realities behind the headlines. Hi, Ross.
Michael, good to be back.
Well, Ross, I like getting your blogs, and I'll leave a link in the show notes to your blog so others can get your insight as well. But in a recent article, you highlighted some of the consequences of the rapid population growth that we're experiencing. What made you write about this again?
Well, there used to be a bloke on one of those lifestyle TV shows here, Ken Brown. It was a boating, fishing, camping sort of format. And he would always end the show with an exhortation to the audience, which was, don't destroy what you came to enjoy.
Interesting.
And it just strikes me that part of the challenge for a very high growth area like Southeast Queensland is that the consequences of growth are starting to erode the very qualities that made the place attractive originally. And just with that in mind, the more I've sort of looked at this issue, the more concerned I've become that we've put population growth up on a pedestal, and it's as if this is an untouchable thing that we can't question. Meanwhile, we're struggling, and the signs of that infrastructure lag are everywhere. We're struggling to maintain the same standards of living and the same quality of life as we had some years ago.
Well, we're hearing a lot about that with people living in tent cities and not getting accommodation, but it's actually a lot more than just a housing shortage, isn't it, Ross?
Well, houses should be the easiest things to do. So if we're struggling with houses, little wonder then that hospitals, schools, roads, other means of transport, even energy and potable water are starting to show signs of stress. And the stress, it's not just an issue of size, which I don't really have a problem with a bigger Australia or a big Australia, but it's a question of speed. And it's the speed at which we're allowing our population to grow versus the much slower speed at which the infrastructure that's needed to support that population is growing. So one's getting ahead of the other. It's a bit like saying driving 100 kilometres an hour through a school zone is reckless, which it is, but the answer is not to stop driving. The answer is to find a sensible, safe speed for everyone to operate, and population growth is no different.
Well, in your article, you mentioned that it was being supported by the big end of town. We know that there's a couple of reasons behind why the government's wanting population growth to keep going on, including getting more taxpayers, boosting our economy, stopping us falling into recession. Who are the big players behind all this?
The big end of town, there's many interests there. And I think at the end of the day, whether they're in business of supplying bulk housing, whether they're in the business of supplying or running a retail business, where population and numbers are critical to your own individual growth. I mean, they're the ones who are calling for more people. But at the same time, I mean, it's a classic Ponzi situation where, you're saying we need more people to help build the houses because there is a shortage of houses because there's more people. I mean, I really don't understand how people can make those statements with a straight face. But I think, we have to look to the great urban philosopher George Costanza, Michael, from Seinfeld, if you ever watched that.
Yes. I was wondering where you were heading with that one. Yes.
Well, he once famously said, "It's not a lie if you believe it." And I think, to be honest, that's what's going on with some of the supporters of continuing rapid population growth. They actually believe that it's good for the country, but the evidence is mounting that it's quite possibly the opposite. In fact, the argument around GDP is weakened because GDP per capita is actually declining.
Yes.
So overall growth is there, but the GDP per capita is declining. And that's because we're diluting the rate of GDP growth by the number of people.
Well, before people who are listening to this say, "Oh, this is an anti-property guy," your background really is you've been pro-property, but also you're looking at having good lifestyle. You're director of Suburban Futures, which is a collaboration of individuals, organisations wanting to give us a better lifestyle. But I just looked at your history again. You were chair of Lord Mayor's Better Suburbs Initiative, past chair of Urban Land Institute. And while you're very much Brisbane-based, that's where you live, I know you've got a good understanding of the whole of Australia. But from what I'm been reading and hearing from you, it seems that Southeast Queensland's suffering a bit more. Why is that?
Well, the infrastructure we've got here today, if I put it in these simple terms, is broadly speaking the same infrastructure that was here when the population was half its size.
Uh-huh.
Okay, we've got 3.5 million people here now, but if you go back to the mid to late 80s, population half the size but the same infrastructure. We're now talking about doubling the population again by the year 2030, 2040, thereabouts.
Yeah.
Using the same infrastructure. So you look around, it's the same hospitals, largely the same schools, certainly mostly the same roads, the same water storage, the same energy grid. A lot of the things were not designed for that speed of growth. And I think the Southeast Queensland has been a very attractive place for people to locate to or relocate from within Australia, and that's terrific. But as I said before, we've just got to make sure that we can keep up with the growth. And that means more than just simply putting roofs over people's heads. It means making sure they've got convenient access to health and education and that they can get around when they need to and that they can continue to afford to live here.
Well, let's put it into context. Queensland or Southeast Queensland's growth has been around 2.2% per annum. Melbourne and Sydney, while the numbers numerically are larger, they're not growing at the same rate, are they? More like 1.5% per annum.
Yeah, and that's what I was saying before about it's a question of speed. And if you say it quickly, 2.2% or 2.5% per annum doesn't sound like a lot. But when you look at the compounding effect, and the speed at which that doubles our population, without the supporting strategy to grow our infrastructure, we are going to fall further behind. Congestion will invariably get worse. Another 1.5 million people will mean most probably around 1 million more cars. I don't know what the plan is for that. But those extra 1.5 or 2 million more people will demand a considerable range of health services, from full-line hospitals through to medical centres. There are approximately, I think, another 500,000 school-age kids will be in that number of the increase in population. They will demand possibly 1,000 new schools if each school was an average of 500 students. If it's not to be all those new schools, it'll mean much larger class sizes. How do people and communities and parents feel about that? There's just consequences whichever way you look at it, Michael. So, I mean, I am an advocate of growth. I've said that before. I'm not anti-property, but I would like to see things done a little better. And we have to realise that the growth, it is a deliberate policy decision of the federal government to allow immigration at the rate we've endured it. Once the people arrive in the country, we can't tell them where to go, but we do have control over our borders. One of the fundamental jobs of a federal government is you control your borders and you qualify the people who come here. So they have deliberately opened the floodgates in terms of population growth at the very time we had a crisis in construction and a number of other things. And home building and house building has fallen to a very cyclical low at the same time as we pumped up demand. Now, any school-aged child with a basic understanding of textbook economics would understand that will end in tears. Well, and that's where we are.
I believe we should be growing and improving our lives and improving our lifestyles. You and I are old enough to see how Brisbane, where you live and where I've been visiting for 50, 60 years. And in fact, all our cities have improved, our lifestyle have improved. I remember when I went to Brisbane and you couldn't get a coffee on a Sunday or shops. But having said that, I also was impressed with your wording, density is destiny, because I used to say demographics is destiny. But I think you're right, density is going to affect how we live.
That's the official policy for how to handle the extent of population growth. It's to build more compact urban forms. So the Southeast Queensland region is destined to house that additional population via increased density within a defined boundary. Now, that density policy has its roots in an era, particularly in the US, where inner city areas were hollowing out. People were leaving them and they were moving out to suburbs. Existing schools and other infrastructure was being underused, and we had the same situation in Australia. And we embarked on a program in the late 1980s led by Bob Hawke and Paul Keating and Brian Howe called the Better Cities program. Yep. And it was all designed about making our inner cities more amenable, bringing people back so that there weren't empty schools. We had to fix things like sewerage infrastructure in Brisbane. We had to do some amendments to transport, and we had to change some zoning. Now, in that amount of time, these places have become much busier. We're trying to build new schools to accommodate that population growth as a result of increased density. And we're starting to find that building schools or hospitals or introducing new infrastructure in areas which are now coping with more people than was originally intended, is a more expensive and time-consuming process than building new communities on the outskirts. So that's ironic. We've adopted a policy position that costs more and takes longer, and at the same time have increased our rate of population growth to record highs.
Well, I think in Southeast Queensland, you've really got more opportunity to spread. Now, there's a different argument about should urban spread continue. Much more restricted in Sydney, where there's geographic boundaries with mountains and waters. I guess Melbourne can spread out further as well. But we know that currently the federal government's got this new policy of building 1.2 million houses or dwellings in the next 5 years. I mean, they're not going to build any of them, of course, are they, the Ross? They're going to try and encourage it. But they're also encouraging density in the other capital cities, not just Queensland.
Yeah, that's right. So, there's nothing wrong with the policy, but if we recognise that there are distinct challenges in increasing density, which amount to much more than just changing from a suburban house on a detached suburban block and in its place building missing middle or gentle density or whatever you want to call it, it's all of the other infrastructure that's required as well. Yes. And that's where the challenge comes in. In fact, I was talking to a developer just this week about a project which is in for consideration by council. An objection came in from left field, not an objection, but a note of caution, if you like, from one of the utilities companies, who made the observation that this is going to stretch the capacity of the utilities network. Therefore, they weren't in support of the density that was being proposed, which is in fact the policy of the state government under the regional plan, the same state government that owns a utility company. So the utility company was objecting to the policy, the consequences of the policy that the state government has in place. Yeah, we've got a bit to sort out, I think, Michael.
Oh, yes, and there's so many conflicting interests involved. As we keep growing, though, and as these challenges are not going to be easily fixed, Ross, I can see them affecting different stratas of society differently. Some people are going to be more affected than others moving forward.
Yeah, well, I think that is sadly true. There is a worry that in Australia at the moment we're hollowing out the middle class, and there's a greater disparity between wealthy people on high incomes or great, large sums of money, asset rich, versus others who are struggling even to find the money to pay for a rented house. The worry, of course, is that these adverse consequences of rapid growth are things that the wealthy members of the community find it easier to buy their way out of that problem. Okay, so they will have the money to
Ross,
send their
sorry
kids
to interrupt you for a sec, but something I've often said is any problem that money can solve isn't really a problem, is it?
Very true. That's exactly right. So, if schools are crowded, they've got the money to send their kids to private schools. If there's hospital waiting lists and ambulance ramping, they're not worried because they've got the best private health cover and access to private health, and so on, right? And so on. Electricity costs start going up, then that's, it's no big deal to someone who can easily accommodate that. But if someone's hit with a $50 or $100 a month increase in their power bill and they're on the borderline, it has a big impact. So I think, the people who are championing the very high rates of growth have come from that area of the community who've got the resources to deal with the consequences. And I don't know that we're giving enough thought to who is being most impacted adversely by some of these consequences. And I think society's got a responsibility to make sure that policies such as the rapid urban population growth that we're seeing are not leading to a reduction in the quality of life or standards of living for a majority of its people.
Just looking back over the years, I see a sort of irony in this density mantra. Initially, it was intended to revitalise our urban centres. Going back a couple of decades, our inner cities were starting to die off a bit, and the inner suburbs were also changing as migrants who often went there near the ports and the cheaper little workers' cottages started to move out to the suburbs. So the higher density and medium density developments had a role and changed things, changed the nature of the suburbs of all our capital cities. But now it seems to be creating more challenges, higher costs, slower delivery. How are we going to balance out this urban density issue, Ross?
Well, as I said, I think we've got a lot of work to do because the discussion has mostly focused, as far as I can observe, on the density of population and the type of housing needed for that higher density population. We haven't addressed how do we deal with the other infrastructure that is a consequence of a more dense population, more densely populated area. So that's your schools and your hospitals and your transport systems and your water and all of the rest of it. All of it, right, that goes with maintaining a quality of life. So our planning schemes are quite weak, I think, in terms of the infrastructure side of things. They're also quite weak, typically, in terms of employment and where we're going to be putting jobs, because there is a widespread assumption, and we've talked about this before, that most of the jobs are in the inner city. Well, that's the assumption of those people who are running those debates who are already in the inner city. They presume that everyone else is like them. But the reality is, with the fast-growing industries like health and education, they're not centralised. No. They are typically highly suburban or regional jobs and regional needs. So that's where that infrastructure should be going. So turning that around, whether it's in a Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane, I don't think makes much difference. We really need to be thinking much more broadly about what density means. It's much more than just a housing choice. Right? It's a great deal more than that.
Well, a lot of the people who are coming to Australia, and remembering, of course, that migrants make up a huge percentage of our population growth, don't really seem to want to go to regional Australia, do they, Ross?
No, but it's a great opportunity. And I'm in rare agreement with the Planning Institute on this, that we do actually need a settlement strategy of some sort, which is more than the misguided notion that you just send migrants to regional cities, or that you create jobs in regional cities by moving entire government departments out there. That's never worked.
Yeah.
If it's been tried, it's doomed to fail. But what does seem to work, and particularly based on the evidence overseas in a number of US markets and fast-growing US cities, is that if there is the quality of particularly health and education infrastructure and other forms of amenity that people are looking for, they are much more likely to attract people and employers. And the simple test of that would be to say, if I was to say to a business, let's say one based in the CBD of Brisbane, that tomorrow we're going to relocate you, all of us are going to be relocated to Chermside, the north side of Brisbane, there would be groans everywhere, and because there would be nothing good about it in terms of the destination's appeal. And likewise, you could say the same of a number of regional cities and towns. People would just say, why on earth would I want to go there? Yeah, it's a dump. And what we need to be doing instead is investing in some of these areas to make them attractive. Make them attractive on the basis that they will have a much more affordable housing, but if they've also got a quality in terms of educational opportunities, in terms of health services, in terms of lifestyle choices and recreation assets and all of the rest of it, and they then become places that are deemed as good places to live and good places to work and good places to play, then we've got a better chance of spreading that burden across a greater number of places in Australia.
Yeah. Clearly what you say makes sense. I guess if the government had the money, they'd do that, or if they had the foresight, they'd do it. I'm not sure that they've got the money. Instead, they spend them on Commonwealth Games. Oh, actually, we're not spending it on the Commonwealth Games, are we? Or on the Olympics. So I think the long timeframes in developing these things doesn't work with the shorter political cycles of wanting to get re-elected again. People in these outer areas probably don't make up enough of the electorate to spend the money there. There's always a challenge that way, isn't there?
There is. I'd suggest that we do have the money, though, but it is continually spent on reinforcing the centralised inner urban cores of our major cities. That's where the majority of capital goes, on the idea, mistaken idea, that that's where everyone wants to be if only they could be. But that's simply not true. And we just need a more geographically diverse strategy around where capital is spent and invested and on what. That would be my first point. The politics of it, but look, we've lived with that for a long time, Michael. It hasn't changed. It's not going to change. I can't see Middle Australia suddenly carrying placards and protesting on the streets. They just never have, and they never will.
Yeah.
But it will be interesting to see how voting changes at the ballot box based on location. And we're already starting to see some patterns where inner city areas, which have the highest concentration of wealthy, expensive real estate and wealthy households, are starting to lean towards, Teals, Greens and others, whereas the working suburbs, if I can call it that, are starting to drift more to the conservative side, which is just an interesting change. And that's not
Isn't
just
it?
here, that's happening in the United States, it's happening in the UK as well.
I just want to take up something that we mentioned in passing. We crossed over when we spoke a couple of minutes ago, when you were first sharing your thoughts with us, and that's the water shortages. Something that, I'm old enough to remember when we actually had water restrictions in Melbourne and you were only able to water your garden on alternate days or things like that. But you made it sound even worse what could happen. More people are going to require water to drink, wash clothes, fill pools and so on. But the infrastructure that we built years ago, the dams and I guess the pipes, they were there to support a population that's half the size they are now.
Well, that's exactly right. And if you asked to see a copy of the water strategy to accommodate the growth strategy, you wouldn't find one, except that there's been reports, allegedly, that, we might look at building another desal plant off the Sunshine Coast, for example, for Southeast Queensland water supply. But no one's asked the Sunshine Coast residents if they want to be looking out at something that resembles a rusting oil rig off the beautiful beaches of Maroochydore and Noosa. And the other irony is that those things are fantastically expensive to operate in terms of energy. They consume a great deal of energy and energy around the clock. And at the moment, if we're to move to renewables as a way of powering desal plants, that might sound good in theory, but you talk to any engineers and they will tell you that the logistics of that are crazy. So here we are, we've got the same water storage capacity as we had many years ago. And because the population is so much greater, if we go into a dry spell, that water is consumed a lot faster.
Yep.
And therefore the likelihood of restrictions arrive much sooner.
You also mentioned about schools, and I was fascinated again by the number of schools we're going to need for all the children that are going to be growing up over the years. And I guess that's then eventually going to translate into universities. I remember years ago in Melbourne, Jeff Kennett at the time got rid of a lot of the schools because they were just empty and consolidated schools. It seems now we're not going to have enough. I remember in a previous chat you talked about the concept of building vertical schools like they do overseas.
Yeah, well, we will have to. The traditional 7-hectare format for a traditional low-density school model with its own sporting fields, there just is not the land in any of our cities to do that anymore. So vertical schools is an obvious solution, but they are a great deal more expensive.
Yeah.
So once again, the consequence of infill, it's more expensive and it will take longer because the sites are harder to find. Right, so it takes longer, it costs more to do. So the cost per child is going to be a great deal more than under the traditional model, if you like. One opportunity that might present itself is with the whole work from home thing and a change in demand for CBD office space in particular, is some of those older towers, grade C, grade B office towers, could convert into schools quite easily because the concentration of people per floor plate is very capable of being serviced by the lifts and the emergency egress facilities and all that sort of stuff. So that can work.
Will they be in the right spot though, Ross?
Well, I would suggest they'd be in a tremendous spot because the transport infrastructure in most of our cities is hub and spoke.
Yep.
So one of the easiest places to get to on any transport network in Australia is the CBD because that's the way they were designed.
Yep.
So if you wanted kids to start catching public transport, you put the schools in the CBD. And then those schools are drawing on a 360-degree catchment rather than just a western catchment, a northern catchment or whatever. Plus, they draw on that catchment not just for the children, but the teaching staff, who would also be quite able to catch a train or some other form of public transport into the inner city as part of schooling. So we need to think very differently as well about how some of those legacy assets are being used because it won't just be a sort of a Manhattan version of all office workers arriving at 9 and leaving at 5. Other uses like around education, health and so on in our city centres make sense to make the most of the transport infrastructure that exists because finding locations for them elsewhere it's really difficult.
I can see that. I guess we also going to have to build more tunnels, Ross. We just can't make the roads wider.
We can't. And the idea that we'll fix this all, we'll just get more people to catch public transport.
Or self-driving cars.
Self-driving cars, all of that. It's a nice idea, but I always said that the most compelling reason why 99 out of 100 people would say we need more public transport is because 95 of them think it means that everyone else will be catching public transport so that I'll be able to drive around.
Yes.
So we're going to, as I said earlier, another 1.5 million people, or for every 1 million people, put it this way, roughly 600,000 to 700,000 more cars.
Gee.
Right? So that's roughly the ratio. And people will use those cars because they are still the most convenient way to get from home to where their work is. Their work is not in the city centre. 8 out of 10 jobs are outside city centres. So you can't really construct a public transport network to do that. With some exceptions, buses are very useful at using the road space, but trains are hopeless at it. And trains can't turn corners. There's a whole bunch of other reasons too
yes.
that they don't work. So we are going to have more cars on the road. and
And
putting
that's despite those
tunnels.
e-bikes. I saw on the weekend, I was surprised how many e-bikes there are and people are using Uber. But there's no doubt many of us still want to be able to get in our car and have a say in where we go and when we go.
And tunnels, well, they make a lot of sense. Tunnelling is getting easier, and we have to accept that tolls will be required. Otherwise, we are going to live in a much more congested urban environment. It's going to take longer to travel to places that used to be 10 or 15 minutes away. They might turn into half-hour trips in each direction. So what is that going to do to the shape of our cities? I don't know. It's certainly going to change. There's no doubt about that. But just simply allowing congestion to get worse in the hope that people will catch public transport and that this will solve itself, that's a fool's dream, that one, I'm afraid.
Now, we've come up with a whole lot of problems, but I think if we're open about things, Australia is still the best place in the world to live. There are queues of people who want to come here, different to many other countries. And despite all the challenges that are going on, I really genuinely believe we're living in the best time in history. Yeah, do we have challenges? Of course we do. Are you positive about the future? Are you hopeful about the future, Ross?
I am, but I'd like to think that we're smart enough to recognise emerging problems before they become major problems. And I just worry that some of our policy discussions have become so shallow, designed around a tweet or a media stunt or some other media-driven initiative, rather than really looking more deeply into what the issues are. I think the Australian public is smart enough to understand that there are no simple fixes, and some of our politicians make promises as if there are simple fixes, but there's not. So we're not stupid. We just like to think that governments don't continue to treat us as being stupid.
Well, it's fantastic that there are voices like you and the people that you associate with to help make us aware of these things, because the media really doesn't give a lot of space to these arguments, does it?
No, sometimes they will. Sometimes they'll dive in. And then you'll find that, some US celebrity has tweeted something or other and all the space is gone. So, we've got the attention span of gnats these days.
Yes, that's true.
Sadly.
That's true.
These are difficult issues. They require long-term strategic commitments. Short-term fixes just get us nowhere. And I think just this whole issue of the speed of growth is something that the average Australian is probably feeling that in terms of the consequences more acutely than the champions of high growth are at the moment. So they will get their opportunity at the ballot box, I guess. Not that anyone has ever been asked to vote on a big Australia or not, but I think soon enough you start to draw the connection between who's wanting a more Labor who's coming in and eroding our quality of life without backing us with the new infrastructure required to look after them. Because otherwise, I think Australia's always had a fantastic history of welcoming new groups, new communities and people from new nations. That history goes back to Chinese, and then we had the Vietnamese, of course, Italians and others after the post-war period, and, many, many, many others. Never been a problem. So I don't think, race or anti-immigration is the thing at all. I think it's just a genuine and valid concern that we want to keep, as I said before, let's not destroy what we came to enjoy. Let's make sure that the things that make Australia attractive will still be the things that are attractive and valuable in years to come.
I think that's a great way to finish our chat. I always enjoy getting together with you, hearing your insights. And as I said, I'll leave a link to your blog in the show notes for anyone else who wants to keep up to date with your thoughts. Thanks for your time, Ross.
Thank you, Michael. Always a pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed my chat with Ross Elliott, and if you did and you don't currently subscribe to this podcast, before we discuss the next couple of things, please just stop for a second. Whichever podcast app you're listening to, please follow or subscribe to this so that twice a week you get the commentary from the experts that I chat with. It'd also be great if you'd leave us a review. That just helps more people know about the podcast. Now, in a moment, I'm going to share my mindset message with you, but I hope you learned from Ross and my discussion just a moment ago that there is going to still be great opportunities in our property markets because the undersupply of properties moving forward means that it's going to underpin our housing markets, but our property markets are going to remain fragmented, not just this year, but in future years, as some people are going to be able to afford to keep upgrading their homes and others are going to have more challenges. And once interest rates fall later this year, and they eventually will, there's going to be a surge of people coming back. It always happens quickly. So really, there's a window of opportunity for those who are interested in getting involved in property right now. Of course, my team at Metropole would love to help you be involved in the property markets. But if you want to get even deeper, dig deeper, if you want to really treat your property investments like a business, I think you should join us at Wealth Retreat 2024 at the end of April, and you'll learn so much more about demographics and the business of property, and you're going to get information from a top faculty of property, tax, finance, demographic and business experts. But you're also going to have the opportunity to network with a whole lot of other movers and shakers, because I guess one question you've got to ask yourself is your current peer group really going to support you in your goals to take your property investing, your business, or your life in general to where you want to be? I've just found too many Australians get stuck simply not having the peer group and advisor network they need to get to the next level. So this is going to be a chance to upgrade your peer group and get access to a whole new level of advisors. By the way, there's nothing to sell there, and I speak to everyone who comes to Wealth Retreat to make sure it's right for you. Don't count yourself out. Go to wealthretreat.com.au. You can't book in. We'll call you to make sure that it's right for you. But lock into one of the few early bird discounts that are left. Go to wealthretreat.com.au. Hey, I'll say it again, wealthretreat.com.au. Learn more about it, register your interest. If you really want to join us, I'll chat with you personally to make sure you'll benefit. And if you will, I'll back it with my money-back guarantee. Put me to the test.
Now here's Michael's mindset message. Remember, a change in your thinking will lead to a change in your life.
In my mindset message today, I'd like to talk with you about a strange way to attract more wealth. Now, at the risk of sounding woo-woo, I'm going to share with you let's call it non-practical way to attract more money, success and wealth. Sure, I teach many hardcore techniques in my blogs, in my podcast, in my writings, but another side of increasing your success and your wealth that's equally important has to do with what's going on between your ears. And I'm talking about how valuable you believe you are. Now stick with me because this could be a game changer for you. The late, great Jim Rohn taught work harder on yourself than you do on your job. Now, you've probably heard me quote Jim Rohn on this point before, but I'm not talking about working on yourself with regard to investments or money or finance knowledge. But my point today is by working harder on yourself, you bring greater value to the marketplace. And when you bring greater value to the marketplace, your income increases. Now, this isn't just if you're in business, serving your clients or your prospects or your patients, but it's also if you're an employee because you bring more value to your boss, to your employer. But it goes beyond that. When you sincerely work hard on yourself, you naturally develop a deeper level of confidence. And when your confidence increases, you make bolder choices. And when you make bolder choices, you experience breakthroughs. But it goes beyond that. When you're sincerely confident, that energy is felt by people around you, by clients, by prospects, by your employer, by other staff members, by people that you manage. And they in turn feel confident in you and your ability to produce results. And that naturally leads to more of whatever you're wanting in success in your life. There's a lot of people out there teaching techniques such as affirmations to increase your confidence. Now, to be honest, that's never worked for me. What has worked is investing in myself, whether that means paying for coaches, paying for mentors, going to seminars when we could, blocking off time to read, listening to podcasts, spending time exercising, improving my health. You don't increase your confidence levels by faking it, but you do by taking disciplined action, which shows that you value yourself. So here's my challenge for you today. schedule at least 1 hour this week to do something that increases how you value yourself. And it doesn't, and it actually shouldn't be related to work. It should be something where you're working on yourself. Maybe it could be reading a good book. Maybe it's taking a walk with no electronics. Maybe it's meditating, yoga, exercise. But until you place a higher value on yourself, your clients, your employer, your partner, people around you won't place a higher value on you either. Well, thanks for spending the last little while with me, and I hope you got some benefit from this show. If you did, and you know somebody else who'd also benefit, please tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. There's a share button on every podcast app. On Apple Podcasts, there's 3 little buttons down the bottom. Press it and share it, or just tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. I hope you're going to be doing them a favour, and you'll definitely be doing me a favour and helping me in my quest to make as many people as possible financially literate. Now, there's ways of catching up with me between these shows. Just look for Michael Yardney on social media, or why not join my private Facebook group? Go to Facebook and look for the Property Update Facebook group. And I have a way of saying thank you to you for subscribing to this podcast. Go to podcastbonus.com.au. There'll be a link in the show notes, podcastbonus.com.au, where you can get a bunch of ebooks and reports. My way of saying thank you. And when you've got time, why not listen to some of the old podcasts? There's individual lessons in each of those that I think would be helpful for you. I'll be back again real soon. In the meantime, have a great week. Make it a great week.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success, and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?